Um, yeah, so first off, we have Her Excellency Yu Yun, the representative of Indonesia in the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Ms. Yu Yun has spent more than 22 years working for human rights organizations on all levels, from the local to the international, such as Human Rights Working Group Jakarta and Oxfam Child Workers Asia. She's joining us from Indonesia. Joining us from Singapore is Professor Kevin Tan, adjunct professor for the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore, as well as the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University. Professor Tan's expertise is primarily in constitutional and administrative law, international law, and international human rights, to which he has written and edited over 40 books exploring the law, history, and politics of Singapore. A very warm welcome to both our speakers, and thank you so much for joining us today. Today's event will proceed as follows. First, I'll be asking both our speakers 3 pre-prepared questions, after which the floor will be open for questions from the audience. Please feel free to use the raise hands function and unmute yourself to ask your question when called upon, or type your questions into the chat box. So without further ado, let's get started. First off, Ms. Yu Yun, could you tell us more about the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights?
Okay, thank you, Christine. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me here. I chair or ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, that we used to call it as ICHR, to make it short, was established in 2009. It is now already 12 years old. I've written, my journal article just published in Journal of Human Rights. So I wrote there some insights about the establishment of ICHR, as well as how it has been developed and evolved until now. But so please check that out. It is open access, but students, you may have the access to the journal articles, but now in the whole April it is going to be open access for general public. It was established in 2009 by the charter, Article 14 of the charter. ICHR work based on the TOR, the term of reference. It has 14 mandates. One out of 14 talk about a protection of human rights, which is mandate 4.10, to obtain information from member states. So the idea was ICHR representative may ask question to member state on the situation of human rights. I will go into how this particular mandate has been implemented, because there has been number of criticism toward ICHR of not having a protection mandate, despite the fact that the very function of regional human rights mechanism or national human rights mechanism or international human rights mechanisms is to actually to protect of human rights. ICHR consists of 10 representatives from 10 countries. I'm sure you know the 10 countries. So if not, please Google. ICHR report to ASEAN Ministerial Meeting every year. So when the ASEAN Ministerial Meeting happened between June or August, or June, July, or August, it depends on the schedule. We have a moment, we have a time to meet with ASEAN foreign ministers, and that is the time when we report to them on our activities, and sometimes we come up with some recommendation, our analysis, and some questions to the foreign ministers. And ICHR meet minimum twice in a year, but in the last couple of years, around 5 years, we have 4 meetings in the year. I'm happy to inform you that we just finished our 33rd meeting just yesterday. So I will be able to share with you what we have discussed in the last meeting. The way of working of ICHR similar with the mother organization, which follow the non-interference principle, evolutionary approach, consultation, consensus, consultative. ICHR itself is consultative body, and it is intergovernmental body. ASEAN has the intergovernmental regionalism rather than supranational supranational regionalism. Intergovernmental regionalism rather put state as the main actor of the regional project, regionalization, and regionalism. But lately, I think ASEAN in general has been trying to move to people-oriented regionalism. So it means not so the main actor is not only state but also people. So people uh, uh, are given some spaces in which people can provide inputs, participated in the process of development. But of course, the process is not yet comprehensive. I think both people as well as the ASEAN still try to find ways how to find the most effective ways to engage with the people. And there was an article because this is an academic forum. There was an article written by Matthew Davis in 2017. He observed that in the last uh, uh, 8-9 years, ICHR has come up with number of functions as educator, as enabler, as standard setter, and as a catalyst. In the last 10 years, ICHR has come up with the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. It was adopted in 2012. And now we are trying to implement or trying to provide the interpretation of articles in the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. So, for instance, number of activities in ICHR related to Article 22, which is the freedom of religion and belief. Article 23 on freedom of expression or opinion. Article 5 on right to remedy. Article 35 on right to development. Article 37, no, Article 28 on right to health, and so on and so on. ICHR also, as a part of family of ASEAN, we try so much and very hard to work with other sectoral bodies. So for instance, with the ASEAN Commission on the Right of Promotion and Protection of the Right of Women and Children, Senior Official Meeting on Social Welfare Development, with transnational organized crime in relation to making the nexus between human rights and prevention of violent extremism. We also work with the SOMTC, Senior Official Meeting on Transnational Organized Crime, in relation to trafficking in person. With economic community, we have not been able to establish a valid cooperation, but we wanted to use the entry point of right to development to establish cooperation. So that's how ICHR has been working so far as a part of ASEAN, and also because ICHR has an instruction from the foreign ministries to mainstream human rights. It means we have to work with sectoral bodies, but also we have responsibility to work with ASEAN member states. And we have to work with other regional mechanism, international mechanism, and national mechanism of human rights, and as well as with civil society and academic. So we have quite diverse, different stakeholders that we need to engage. At some point, it depends on the issue. Some issues we only engage with sectoral bodies, or we can only engage with member states because some of the member states may feel uncomfortable if civil society are there. But for that to accommodate this kind of request, usually we will have a meeting with civil society in different day, not in the same day, but it is only a limited occasion. So, but in one of our activities, we try to bring different stakeholders, different opinion, different perspective into the discussion, and this is the way in which member states can learn from other member states, also can listen to civil society. So gradually, ICHR provide a platform in which dialogue can be happened. Sometimes dialogue is not happening at the national level, depending on the regime of the country. But when it comes to regional, this kind of dialogue between and among different groups can happen. So this is something that we found as a way of making a change in ASEAN region. We do not name and shame, but rather we provide a platform in which dialogue, conversation can be done. My last point, I just would like to share the experience when we had a workshop in relation to right to development. We invited the national planning agencies of all countries in the region, together with civil society and as well as academic researchers. After the presentation of some countries, the national agencies, the national planning agencies from Cambodia and Laos approached me saying, thank you very much for inviting me here, because now I know how to mainstream human rights into our existing planning, uh, uh, development planning, what is the existing planning of development. And we do not need to wait until the current planning finish, but rather we can do it now. And then and that's how the workshop actually happened. We provide a platform, exchange happen, inputs, conversation happen in one room, and then the change will be done by the member state. We are not imposing changes, but rather it is the decision of the member states to do that. And it is very important then to invite the correct and the the right person to come to our meeting, so they can immediately bring some of the ideas and contextualize that ideas into their own uh, when they back home. So I think I will stop there.
Thank you so much for the really fantastic introduction of not only kind of like the history of human rights and how like ASEAN has tried to deal with it increasingly, and how like we're trying to institutionalize processes in the system. And historically, I guess we've not been super great with that. So I think it's really interesting to hear how we've progressed and the way forward. So the next question is Professor Tan. So put it in like very briefly, in your opinion, what is Singapore's role in Southeast Asia's human rights law ecosystem?
Wow. Well, maybe before I answer that question directly, it's good to try and understand the Southeast Asian landscape a little bit better. I think Yuen has given us a very good introduction into the formation of AICHA, but I think one needs to understand the conditionalities of Southeast Asia and the place of human rights within that. And then I'll say a little bit about what I think Singapore's role is. Um, First of all, I think people don't realize that Southeast Asia is actually a very large and diverse area. In terms of population, it's almost the size of the European Union. I mean, if you look at a country like Thailand, for example, it's almost as big as and has as many people as a country like France. So people, sort of think Southeast Asia is a fairly small area. Actually, it's not. And it consists primarily of two parts. There's mainland Southeast Asia and there's archipelagic Southeast Asia. And Singapore is part of the sort of the archipelagic part, right? Where you got, thousands and thousands of islands, primarily those of Indonesia and the Philippines. So if you understand that this is the geography of Southeast Asia, you will know that the countries are actually very very different from each other, very diverse. It's not there's something to be said about contiguous land masses. In other words, if you were living right next to each other, in a contiguous land mass, uh, these kinds of differences are not as badly exacerbated as they are by water bodies. So, one island is very different from another island, much less, 13,000 different islands. So, my point about this is that Southeast Asia is extremely, extremely diverse if you look at it. And therefore, reaching consensus is always a problem. because of this diversity. It is diverse not only in terms of languages and customs and religions and peoples, but also because of history. The second important point to understand about Southeast Asia is that other than Thailand, every single Southeast Asian state has been a colony of one European power or other in the past. Thailand was, or Siam as it was then known, was able to sort of keep itself neutral, right? Very cleverly sort of playing the British off against the French. But basically, every state in Southeast Asia was a former colony. Now, what's the relevance of that to the human rights landscape? Well, there is a very important point to be made in relation to this, and that is that having then won independence in the post-war era, and mainly during the 1950s and 60s, when most of the Southeast Asian states became independent, sovereignty is something that is extremely precious to the states in Southeast Asia. So if you are looking for the establishment of a supranational kind of regionalism, using Yu Yun's phrase, supranational regionalism as opposed to interstate regionalism, this is going to be very, very difficult, because having won independence and now having its own sovereignty and finally having sort of control over your own lands and your peoples and resources, you're not about to give it up too easily. So sovereignty is a very, very important point uh, that is defended very, very assiduously by the Southeast Asian states. So you can, if you want to try and understand that the non-interference aspect of ASEAN, right? You have to understand this point. Um, Now, in terms of the sort of ecosystem of Southeast Asia human rights, I'm not sure that one could even say there is something called an ecosystem. We have the AICHA, ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission. Uh, I mean, that said, we are in fact the only regional body in the whole of Asia. Now, we have got regional human rights mechanisms in Europe. Of course, the most successful, the European system. We've got a system between in the Inter-Americas, and you've got a system maybe not as well known, but in Africa as well. So if you're looking at the sort of regions of the world, in UN terms, just regions, there isn't any in Asia except for ASEAN, right? And then that's probably, now if you look at the way in which even AICHA came about, this was not something that was envisaged. In fact, here's a little plug, unfortunately, self-interested plug for a little book that I edited recently that just came out this year on ASEAN and human rights. Uh, it's got essays by local international scholars and Indonesian scholars, but there is a chapter in here by Bilahari Kausikan. Bilahari, in fact, was his ambassador at large in Singapore. He's now chairman of the Middle Eastern Institute at our university. And he was very much involved in the big human rights debates of the 1990s. He represented Singapore at the Vienna conference in 1993, for example. So in it, being a thoroughbred ASEAN insider, he gives this account of how AICHA actually came about. And if you read this, you begin to wonder how it. I mean, the fact that it actually exists today is a bit of a miracle, right? Because this was not something anybody wanted, but there's something to be said for the power of human agency. So people pushed it, and right. So there was the eminent persons group, and one of the members of the group actually decided to push this agenda of human rights, right? And throughout the essay, actually, Bilahari tells us that, you know, after the Vienna conference in '93, everybody had to say, you know, the politically correct thing, that is that we should have a human rights mechanism, we should safeguard human rights, and so on and so forth. But it was really more lip service than you know, an intention to realize such an institution. And he actually said that, you know, one of these eminent persons uh, members was prepared to put um, the the cohesion of ASEAN, at stake by introducing this, and in fact, he says, why are we looking for trouble when there isn't trouble? But somehow things have a way of taking a life of its own, and so what you now have, of course, is the Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. As a human rights scholar looking at these things, you would say, oh, that's such a weak institution. It's not meant to do anything. Um, and I suppose you could say, well, the same could possibly be said of ASEAN, although ASEAN is very important for a number of states within the region, right? ASEAN was never established in the same way, say, the European Union was established. It was an organization that arose out of the conflicts in the region during the Cold War and following Indonesia's confrontasi with Malaysia. So, if you look at those antecedents and how it was actually created, you would imagine that ASEAN as an organization is really not meant to be very powerful. It's meant to coordinate. Um, One of my friends, Ong Keng Yong, was once Secretary General of ASEAN, and in fact, when he got appointed, I congratulated him, and he turned around and he said, "Hey, Kevin, I'm more Secretary than General, right?" So this is how ASEAN kind of works, right? And the budget of ASEAN, I was astounded to find out, actually is smaller than that of my law faculty at ANUS. So if you look at these factors thrown together, you get an idea of Southeast Asia as a region, the importance of regionalization and regionalism, and then in that place, the importance of human rights. So while human rights is certainly something that is important, it is not pursued in the same manner, and maybe also not in accordance with the kind of sentiments that prevailed in Europe following the end of the Second World War. It's a very, very different beast altogether. So where does Singapore feature in all of these things? Well, Singapore is one of the smallest states in ASEAN. In fact, it's the second smallest state. Only Brunei is smaller. And so Singapore has never thought that it would be the lead, right? So Singapore always does the middling thing, we call it, right? You never be the first and you never be the last. And so if you're going to push a particular human rights agenda, well, it's not going to be Singapore that's going to push it. But neither does Singapore want to be the last one to adopt any particular human rights initiative, if that were the case. Now, when there was the ASEAN 5, when there were only 5 states in ASEAN, before the CMLV countries came in, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam joined ASEAN in the 1990s, Singapore was always considered to be the most conservative of the ASEAN states. So in terms of human rights, you always had the Philippines pushing the agenda, uh, and pre-Suharto downfall, Indonesia also wasn't really pushing that agenda very much. So it was always Philippines, Thailand during the period of the ASEAN 5. But after the admission of more ASEAN members, then I think the dynamics began to change, and of course the regional politics began to change. Right, Suharto's downfall following the Asian financial crisis in 1997 transform Indonesia. And so Indonesia began to move forward. And in regional meetings appeared to be pushing human rights agenda far more aggressively than even the Philippines. So right now, if you sort of look at that landscape, sort of the progressives, the ones who want to push and advance human rights, you would see probably Indonesia and the Philippines right up front pushing this. And then you see at the other end a reluctance to be dragged along. Perhaps the CMLV countries and Brunei, and so Singapore now, from being sort of at that end of the spectrum, being smack right down the middle now, and that's a nice place to be, because you are able then to act as some kind of I mean, our foreign ministry officials always like to say that Singapore is an honest broker. We are small, we don't threaten anybody. We are prepared to do the work, we are prepared to do the grunt work. So if we can act as a bridge between those pushing forward on one end and those on the other end, that's a nice place to be. So I think if you look at it in that perspective, being such a small state, Singapore um, does not wish to be seen to be pushing a particular agenda. But it would be very happy in all these instances to be the active facilitator in these regional movements.
That's very interesting, and I really appreciated how you kind of brought into the conversation the fact that Southeast Asia has a very unique history as a community of post-colonial states and how that is affecting our relationship with sovereignty and international organizations such as ASEAN, and also kind of laying down why is it that ASEAN behaves in such a different way from other organizations that would be compared to it traditionally. Um, so moving on to our next question, back to Ms. Yu Yun. In recent memory, Southeast Asia has gone through complex and painful experiences with human rights violations, such as the Khmer Rouge and the Vietnam War. What do you think is unique about the region's relationship and history of human rights?
Well, I think this region is rather different from the African Union. African Union ways of developing the its regional human rights mechanism uh, was actually generated from the concerns over the influx of refugees in that time. I cannot remember the year, but in ASEAN or Southeast Asia, the experience of colonialism is rather color the way human rights has been discussed. I would like to add what Professor Kevin mentioned earlier. So in 1993, for instance, on Vienna Declaration, in Vienna Conference of the World Conference of Human Rights in Vienna, the the experience of being in the process of the colonization, divorcing from the colonial past, was rather thicker than the history of the painful history. That is why the idea of non-interference principle, sovereignty has been very strong in ASEAN. If you look at the when I assess whether when ASEAN as a region, as a regional organization, started to talk about human rights, I found that in 1991, Prime Minister in that time, Mahathir Mohamad, mentioned about human rights, and the way he mentioned about human rights was rather looking at it as with cautious, that we need to be very careful because the powerful countries, the international organization in that time, IMF, will come to us and offer some cooperation with the condition of human rights. And so the entrance of human rights in ASEAN was in that kind of context, and that was in 1991. In the statement, the chairman's statement, joint communique in 1992 repeat the same discourse, and then 1993 the World Conference of Human Rights. But the World Conference of Human Rights had preparation, long preparation before the 1993. So if you can look at the earlier document, there was a discussion prior to the Vienna conference. There was, before going to Vienna, there was a meeting in Bangkok, and then come up with Bangkok Declaration, and but the tone almost similar, that we do not want to be no, the tone is so I interview Bilahari Kausikan, also Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, on this. I think I got the dimension of how actually ASEAN countries in that time thought about human rights. It was rather accepting human rights as a universal value, but at the same time, the promotion of human rights should follow the context. This has been translated by the by international community and media. Rather, ASEAN countries propose the Asian values. But the way Ambassador Bilahari Kosikan also perceived this, that ASEAN countries in that time wanted the international community to see that there is imbalance of power in that time, because countries of Southeast Asia just free from colonialism, and this kind of dimension that was not mentioned in the discussion. So as a scholar, the way I see it, there is an intention to be mentioned there, but the reception was rather different, and it was framed into Asian values, cultural particularism. So that's from this perspective. Other perspective may also come in. Number of articles also discuss about the Asian values after 1993, which actually rather expanded from what initially thought. So that's what I gathered. Uh, um, but the point is, there has been number of concerns over colonialism rather than from the painful history of Khmer Rouge or others. Um, so, but then in 1997, the discussion of human rights was driven by the financial crisis. ASEAN wanted to come up with a new phase. ASEAN wanted to introduce something that different from the previous ASEAN, and to invite investor come into the region, and it actually worked. So ASEAN introduced good governance, rule of law, human rights, and democracy. And it is already included in the political security community blueprint, as well as reflected in the ASEAN Charter. So there, these two elements actually the one that color or shape the way human rights has been discussed and developed in the region, not necessarily the past human rights the past pain history. What happened after ICHR was established? Whether or not these two discourses, having the experience of being colonized and um, um, uh, to project the new face of ASEAN still appear. I would say in my experience, since I'm the ICHR representative since 2019 until now, I would say that this has been also reflected in our discussion, but not in the formal discussion, but rather in workshops. So in workshops, a number of individual representative may say whatever they want, but in the official meeting, we rather speak based on the talking points. So it's rather formal. So in my engagement with ICHR representative in number of workshops, uh, uh, some members still invoking the idea of, look, if we accept this, it means actually we are agreeing to what the powerful country what want to impose to us. So, but this is at the level of personal, it is not official position. But you can see that the assumption, the way human rights has been seen, continue to be shaped by these two elements of our previous event, such as colonialism uh, and the the financial crisis, the experience of financial crisis, which you want to project the new ASEAN. So this continue to be always appear in our informal discussion rather. And if you look at the development of the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, there has been some kind of changes in the way human rights has been discussed in 1993 during the World Conference of Human Rights. I got a sense that looking at the discussion, because there was a leak of document that published by Mizima, the newspapers in Myanmar. The leak document portray the debates among member states about some issues in relation to universality of human rights. So there was an argument there from one or two countries saying that we do not oppose the universality of human rights, but we will oppose. This is not literally text. This is my interpretation. We do not oppose the universality of human rights. What we oppose is how our system, how our way of developing the supporting mechanism for human rights should follow what the international has been done. It means it is uniformity that some member states are opposing, and this language actually rather different from previous one, but there is a similarities. It means if you look at the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, it is not the protection that Asian member state oppose, but protection but promotion of human rights should can be applied into particularism, following the culture, the situation, the context, and so on and so on. So in the language that appear in the development of ASEAN Members Declaration, almost similar but the different term, such as using we do not want to have uniformity of human rights because they have their own mechanism. So I would like to use different practices in the region. At the moment, we have national human institution, 5 countries in the region, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, and the Philippines. But in Laos, each convention that ratified by Laos has committee, national committee. So there is a national mechanism to monitor the implementation of the convention, whether or not it is fit with the what international community asks for by establishing the independent national human rights mechanism, maybe not. And this is the argument that proposed by Laos. I'm not here to say that it is right or wrong, but what the argument of member state in that time actually opposing the uniformity, because they believe they know what the best for them. So that's, I think, this element of perception, this element of position of member states, not necessarily often appear in the scholarly discussion as well as the general public discussion. Again, I'm not in the position of saying that this is right or wrong, but that's how ASEAN member states wanted to portray itself. In relation to the extent of member state commitment of human rights, there are certain level of commitment of human rights, but again, they wanted to do it in their own ways, and this is something that may be questioned by the treaty bodies on how things are done. But the conversation between member state and treaty bodies is always about dialogue and finding solution, and then come up with a recommendation, and recommendation will be followed up. So it's more engagement from time to time. But back to your question, in my experience so far and my observation so far, the past painful history of each member states do not necessarily lead to particular norms, but rather the experience of being colonized and the interest to project the new ASEAN, which is more modern than before, respecting the universal values like human rights, democracy, rule of law, and good governance. This is something that shape the way norms of human rights established in the region.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. So in the interest of time, we're gonna kind of speed on to the last pre-prepared question that will be asked to both Professor Tan as well as Ms. Yu Yun. And I'm sure this must be on everyone's mind. And the question goes, how has the recent military coup in Myanmar affected human rights norms in the region? So maybe we can start off with Professor Tan, if you could like summarize your thoughts in like a minute or two, just so we can have enough time for some open Q&A.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, I think what has happened in Myanmar is in itself not a human rights issue. In other words, this is a total breakdown of the rule of law, where the military has come in to take over a legally elected government and impose martial law. Now, what impact that has on human rights is that in an emergency situation like this, they claim to be an emergency, many aspects of the rule of law get suspended. So rights that are embedded even in the constitution of Myanmar will be suspended. So the military is able to, you know, do whatever it likes under the guise of national security and public order. So what it does to Myanmar is that it has added to the already long list of human rights issues that already exist in Myanmar. In other words, even if there was a properly legally elected government in Myanmar right now, they already have a whole host of human rights issues, right? Everything from child soldiers to human trafficking to the situation with the Rohingyas. It's already there. What this has done is to exacerbate it, right? Where basically nobody is going to be held to account. Nobody wants to be held to account. ASEAN has been making some noises about it, but I don't think much else could be done. I mean, I know in Singapore, our Prime Minister has been speaking up about this, and everybody is sort of telling Myanmar that they should release the political leaders, go back to their democratic form of government, but nothing seems to be working. So what it has done is that it's exacerbated all the existing problems, and under the guise of an emergency and national security and public order, more human rights abuses are likely to occur.
I see. And Ms. Yu Yun, your perspective on the issue?
Yes, what happened in Myanmar right now is a challenge to ASEAN on the norms that ASEAN has been established in the and agreed by all countries member of ASEAN. Especially, I think ASEAN chairman statements repetitively mention about the norms that I mentioned earlier: democracy, human rights, good governance, as a rule of law, as well as constitutional government. Particularly in constitutional government, the reason why the word constitutional government appear in ASEAN Charter was about the coup. So during the discussion in 2004, before the ASEAN Charter, so the discussion to develop the political security community, member states talk about what would be the reaction of ASEAN member state when the member stage a coup after the charter. Whether we want to accept it, whether we want to accept whoever come as the result of the coup, or how the ASEAN membership should react to this. So there has been a number of discussion, and then there was a discussion about the sanction, about expelling the not expelling the freezing the membership of ASEAN members if the coup happened. But these all options were not necessarily accepted, but rather use the word constitutional government. So it means all members of ASEAN should respect the process of establishing a government constitutionally. So that is why, rather than making the negative sentence about the coup and things, they put constitutional government. So it legally bound each member state that government of ASEAN member state should be established constitutionally. And the Article 20 if in the ASEAN Charter mentioned that if member state uh, uh, not in compliance with the ASEAN norms, the issue can be brought to the ASEAN summit. But it doesn't necessarily clear what does it mean with this particular article, whether the summit will decide whether this is compliant or non-compliant, or the summit will talk about how member states should react to this situation. It's just the text is rather vague, but it just give assurance that if there is non-compliant action, so it should be brought to the summit. So so that's the coup. From the perspective of ICHR, yesterday we just had a meeting, 33rd meeting of ICHR, 6 until 8 April, and ICHR agreed to add one agenda item. We call it agenda item 15 on the current development of human rights in ASEAN, in which we can talk about human rights situation. It was Indonesia's proposal, and Indonesia initially not to put Myanmar in, but we want to talk about Myanmar. We don't want to single out country, but everyone knows that we are going to talk about Myanmar because we're concerned about Myanmar. By the way, before this, some ICHR representative released press statement denouncing the coup on the 5th of February, signed by representative of Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, and Malaysia. So this agenda item 15, we talk about human rights in the region, started from Myanmar, and Myanmar has been quite cooperative to listen our concern, our grievance in relation to the situation, and we list down some of the issues. So, for instance, we recognize that there has been enforced disappearances, torture, the violation of human rights, of freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of opinion, as well as access to information. Media freedom was also violated. Summary execution, arbitrary detention happened during the coup. So we present this kind of concern during the meeting, and we have some of exchange of views in terms of how ICHR can better respond to the situation. We have different kind of ideas, but I'm very happy that ASEAN ICHR agreed to offer itself to help Myanmar. And this is the first time that ICHR in the last 12 years talk about country-specific issue, which and then has this specific agenda in which member state can discuss about it and can make statement of concern about the situation and discuss about what possible thing that ICHR can do. This is the first time that we agreed. It doesn't mean that we do not have attempts before. Indonesia has been a push for engaging with to engage with the process of the Rakhine crisis. After AHA Center come up with the reports on the preliminary need assessment, AHA Center made 2 or 3 recommendations, and myself as a representative of ICHR believe that there is something that ICHR can do. And then I wanted to table that in the meeting, but it was blocked by some countries. So we did not discuss that. So that is why now we can discuss it. It's something very, it's new, and it's a breakthrough. It's the first experience that ICHR has this kind of agenda item agreed by everyone, and not only having agenda and not only having expressing the concern, but we discuss about it, and we discuss about what we can do. So yesterday meeting was a very different meeting of ICHR, and I felt that this is how the human rights body should do. We talk about human rights. We talk about the rights of people in one country, one or two countries, or the whole ASEAN, and we need to talk about what ICHR can do to deal with this, with limitation of our mandates. ICHR stand ready to assist Myanmar. So to me, that's already a good thing. So in ASEAN, we always learn how to appreciate a little victory. Small thing. Maybe this is something, nothing for African Commission or Human Rights or Inter-American Commission of Human Rights or European Court, but this is a big thing for ASEAN. This for ICHR in particular. This is a first step in which we can continue, because in very early age of us ICHR, we need to capitalize milestones. We need to establish steps. We need to introduce institutional memory. Representative only work in ICHR for 3 years, can be extended for another 3 years. But if we have this as a milestone, the next representative will be able to say that, oh, we have experience before, so this is not something new, we can continue. So that's, I think, what representative has been doing so far, establishing building blocks. Oh yeah, so that's it, building blocks. So so I see this position rather as a process, that in this time our batch contribute on this part, and then maybe next batch will contribute to something else. But that would, in the end, it will build hopefully a mechanism that can protect human rights in the region.
Mhm.
So that's the way ICHR perceive the coup in Myanmar right now. It's challenging the norms that we have been agreeing by consensus, both in ASEAN Charter as well as in the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration.
Thank you so much to both Professor Tan as well as Ms. Yu Yun for your perspective on this question. I understand that we are technically at the full hour at this point. However, we would love to kind of engage with the audience a little bit with some of the questions that they have. So if Ms. Yu Yun and Professor Tan, if you have maybe another 10 to 15 minutes to spare, as well as to our audience members, we're gonna keep going a little bit. And I see that we have a question in the chat box asking about human rights violations in Asia that occurred mainly during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. So maybe either Mr. Yun or Professor Tan, if either of you have any insight on this question, we would love to hear it.
Um, can I go ahead, Professor
Yeah.
Tan? ICHR has no mechanism yet to address the issues. ICHR has no mandate to investigate, to monitor a human rights violation. But in November 2019, ICHR has agreed to establish three-step complaint mechanism. So three-step complaint mechanism means we agree to receive the complaints from individual, from group individual. So this is again a breakthrough, and this is a continuation of what the previous representative has been working very hard. It just culminated in the November 2019. The complaint can be submitted to the ASEAN Secretariat by the email of ICHR@ASEAN.org, and then ASEAN Secretariat will table it in the meeting of ICHR, and then the respected country it's up to them whether they want to respond to the complaint or not. From November 2019 until now, member state have received some complaints, including Indonesia. And I received one complaint in relation to the human rights defenders. As a practice, regional human rights mechanism should consult with national human rights mechanism whether the case is under their care or other investigation of the National Human Rights Mechanism. So I consulted with Komnas HAM, and Komnas HAM said this case already got the decision by the court. So now what Komnas HAM is doing is monitoring the implementation of the decision of the court. So with that, regional human rights mechanism like ICHR should not touch this issue until all mechanism at the national level be used, then and then the victim feel that they don't get the justice, then the case can be brought uh, 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 to ICHR. But at the moment, the mechanism in ICHR is not necessarily comprehensive or be able to respond to that. Uh, so that this how human rights has been uh, uh, dealt with in the last 11 years. But with this agenda item 15 introduced to the meeting of ICHR, we might be able to talk about the issue and to talk about how we can move forward with the issue, despite the fact our TOR does not say so. So we have been uh, breaking, we have been actually evolving the mechanism despite the fact that the TOR does not change. You know, so um, so let's see how we can use the ICHR in the future to address the problems.
Thank you, Mr. Yoon. Professor Tan, do you have any comments on the question?
Just a very quick one. This comes from Christine, right? I'm sorry, Christine. I think the question is a little bit wide. I mean, you're asking about the kind of human rights problems that arose during the pandemic in the whole of Asia. I cannot possibly answer that question simply because I don't know what the problems may be throughout the whole of Asia. But I can tell you what are the sort of human rights issues that are likely to arise because of um, measures that were adopted by various governments during the time of the breakdown. So generally speaking, if you one of the rights that have been seriously affected are rights of freedom of movement and rights of freedom of assembly. Um, but as you know, in even in the all the international human rights documents, these are actually derogable rights. In other words, they are not absolute. They can be taken away in certain kinds of situations. So I think the only problem that may arise is that maybe the reasons for the lockdowns may not be as legitimate in some cases. Now, again, here I'm not pointing fingers at any particular group or state simply because I don't know the situations in this. In the sense, it's a bit too early to tell, right? I mean, the pandemic has been with us for about a year, and these issues are only going to surface a little bit later. The other aspect of it, where rights are being affected quite seriously, are in states where you are unable to provide adequate medical attention to people who are suffering from the from the virus, right? And adequate, and so that cuts across the board to adequate medication, adequate food and sustenance, water and that sort of thing, as a consequence. Um, and that's not even going into sort of the big socioeconomic rights of of a livelihood and so on. I think so many businesses have collapsed. We're not even going into that. So really a whole host of issues that would have arisen as a consequence of uh, the the outbreak, the COVID outbreak. The only question is that if we want to talk about it in terms of rights and about human rights and enforceable rights, human rights are generally enforceable as against states. And so if it's not the state that created the problem, then it gets a little bit more complex, right? Some things are just beyond everybody's control. I'm afraid I can't give you a better answer than that. It's all very tentative.
Thank you so much, Professor Tan. That was a very, I think it's really interesting when we think about human rights in the pandemic. I mean, as an organization, UNA, UCLA, we are situated in the US, and a lot of times conversation and what is my rights, what is not my rights, and we know the conversations about rights are often very heated here in the US. And I think, Professor Tan, what you touched on is definitely sensitive issues that many community members in the US are always kind of discussing and grappling with what is considered an overstep of the government, what is considered necessary measures. So it's a really thought-provoking question, and especially when we consider how human rights is evolving and how it has to respond and adapt to the needs and the times, I guess. We will take one more question. I see Alana, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I have a question specifically for Professor Tan. So freedom of speech and protest is a highly contested issue in Singapore and the region in general, as ASEAN and the region continues to address serious violations for free speech and protests in Myanmar. How do you foresee the fight for these freedoms to progress in Singapore and the region in general? Thank you.
Okay, I think this is one of these typical tropes that we deal with. Okay, there's no freedom of speech in Singapore. It's highly constrained, and so on. I think one needs to be a little bit more nuanced in drilling down some of these problems. So when you say that freedom of speech is a problem in Singapore, well, the question then is, what are you actually talking about? I mean, what is it that you want to say and you're not allowed to say it? I mean, the Constitution does protect free speech. It is limited to citizens rather than to all persons. So citizens have the right to freedom of speech, assembly, and association under Article 14, subject, of course, to various limitations, which are found in international instruments, right, where there's a public order issue involved and so on and so forth. Now, where there are some very serious limitations to speech here, and which I think are rather more legitimate, is the concern over hate speech that may be articulated. Singapore, believe it or not, I mean, for a little island state of 5.5 million people, is the most religiously pluralistic country in the entire world. In other words, there are more people having more different types of religions in Singapore than in other parts of the world. So having to live in this tiny little space, cheek by jowl with each other, there is always this concern that any kind of speech that may be extremist in some way, or terribly insulting, might foment some kind of a public order disturbance. Now, the one thing that, of course, has gotten everybody up in a knot is over this thing called the POFMA, Prevention of now I can't even remember, prevention or protection against online false news, right? Which is highly contested. Now, this is not something which I think even Singaporeans are prepared to accept, uh, uh, just like that. I think it's highly contested. There have been instances where they have been used uh, and in fact, in our highest court now, in the Court of Appeal, there are two cases that deal specifically with the constitutionality as well as the application of these freedoms. So, if you want to talk about how do we move ahead, I think it's always this challenge, right? The state will always want to ensure that it has the last say on all these matters. But I think the state also realizes that you cannot, you see, I mean, if you keep shutting people down, it will simply resurface somewhere else, right? And the more you forbid, I mean, it's a little bit like kids, right? You stop them, you see, you can't have this cake, or you can't have this sweet, and all the more they want to have it because it's kind of forbidden. So I think they do realize these tensions, and it will constantly be a tension. It will be, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, back and forth on these issues. But some of the issues are very real. Hate speech problems are very real. Some people would say, well, um, you know, it's not a problem, right? So this is always the question. Now, this is about calibration. do you wait for the problem to blow up in your face and then you deal with it, or do you try and preempt the problem? In America, they wait for it to blow up in your face, all right, or very close to that. The test of the U.S. Supreme Court, it's called clear and present danger. It's a clear and present danger. You see it, but very often by the time you see it, well, it will blow up in your face, right? In the case of Singapore, the courts have accepted that the government may take what they call a prophylactic approach, in other words, a preventive approach, right? Just in case. So this is a question of political judgment more than, sort of a rule of law. It's one of proportionality. You could say, well, you don't need such a sledgehammer type of law to deal with this particular problem. On the other hand, some people think you would. So this is where we are, always in the middle of a debate. And I think it flows and ebbs according to the situation. I mean, at the time when the attack on the World Trade Center took place, nobody was arguing about preventive detention laws. In fact, the Patriot Act in America provided for preventive detention, except that it never happens in the United States. You throw them in Guantanamo Bay, right? And it's off federal territory. But that didn't seem to be a real issue because the threat was considered to be quite significant. I'm not sure I've satisfactorily answered your question, Alana, but this is in fact the situation. It is a constant struggle. It keeps going back and forth. But having taught constitutional law for the last 35 years, I can tell you that the situation today is a much better situation than it was 35 years ago. We have made some progress.
That was a really good answer.
Thank you, Professor.
Sorry.
No, thank you, Alana, for your question, and thank you, Professor Tan, for your insight. I distinctly remember the upheaval that kind of happened when POFMA was first introduced into Singaporean law. I remember being back home and a lot of people going, this is censorship to the nth degree, this is terrible, like no one can say anything anymore. So it's very interesting to listen to your insights on, I guess, Singapore's position when it comes to freedom of speech, especially. So thank you so much for that. So we are just going to very quickly wrap up our event for today. Thank you once again to Professor Tan and Ms. Yu Yun for your insightful perspectives, and thank you as well to our audience members for asking many thought-provoking questions. This brings us to the end of this event. Could we please have a round of applause for both of our speakers?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. If you're interested in learning more about UNA at UCLA and keeping up with our events, please feel free to join our mailing list via the link in the chat. Alana, if you could put it in there right now. And following us on our Instagram at UNA UCLA. If you're a UCLA student, do consider joining our club as a general member. And thank you, everyone. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Okay, can board members please stick around for a little bit? Like a couple of minutes.